God's priestly community. Undoubtedly there was priesthood right from the beginning, but this study picks up a momentous moment within the history of the world, and particularly in Israel's history, when God broke them out of Egypt and formed them into his special treasure, brought them to himself. We begin reading from that account of that by Moses in Exodus 19. On the third new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. And they set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. And there Israel encamped before the mountain while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." In moving through this study, I want us to particularly focus on the importance of God's presence in making all of this to come about. "I've brought you," he says, "to myself." When we read the story of the Exodus, we see them coming through the Red Sea, and we may see them ending up in Sinai, but God says, "No, or in Canaan." But God says, "No, I've actually brought you to myself." To be brought to him is to be brought to where the fire burns. A great exposing happens. God exposes himself to the nation. There is an exposition continually from now on to Israel of what it means to live as a nation with idolatry all around and often within. So this is the emergence point from which Israel dances and droops its way often through to Jesus. But underneath and consistent in all of that time is the declaration and the intent and the actuality that God says, "I will bring you to myself." Before Israel was given a structure, that is a Levitical internal priesthood, God established her as his priest nation. So her priestly ministry was not first of all internal and for herself, but had to do with what God planned for all nations. "But you shall be called the priests of the Lord. They," that is the foreigners, "shall speak of you," that is Israel, "as the ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of nations." In other words, their glory shall be your boast. What will be their glory? God has brought us to himself as he has brought you, Israel, to himself. That was to be Israel's glory, to be her boast. Who Israel was, how she had become who she was, and where she was headed had to do with what God had covenanted to her forefather Abraham. Remember, she was to become a great nation. The greatness promised to her, or promised to Abraham, was not to be like the greatness of other nations. Rather, it had to do with the nature of God's presence to her and his plan for the whole creation that he was going to reveal through her. Her greatness was the light given her to lighten the nations, as Isaiah saw. Thus saith God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people in it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, for the nations, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, and to bring out prisoners from the dungeon and from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that's my name, my glory I will give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I'll tell you. So Israel could only bear to the nations, what God blessed her with. She had no light in and of herself. Her light was the light of the Lord. We could say the presence of the Lord. Her life, lived under the grace of God's covenanted presence, became a light in the darkness of universal idolatry. By the Lord's blessing, she would become like a well-watered garden and a spring that would not fail. Israel's priesthood would be marked by the effusiveness of the love and the mercy and the purpose of God. So this paper is really an exploration of the greatness of Israel's priesthood according to God's effusive presence and ministry to her. As Israel received God's covenant with joy and played it out in daily life in the practical familial blessings of God's law, it would declare God's will to and for the nations. So Israel, priest nation, formed by the presence of God. God's presence formative from the beginning. It's always been that way. The personal presence of the Lord to his people was always essential in the outworking of the covenant. Seen first in Eden, the couple knew him as the one who was present. Knowing his will in the context of his presence, that is, in the context of seeing the nature of his loving, humanity could delight in life with him. Nothing of his commanding or his commands would have been seen as burdensome. This means that the true glorifying of God would have been freely shared. So the importance of delighting in him and honouring him is clear from the beginning, as Paul makes it clear in Romans 1, when he says the opposite of honouring him, of ignoring him and ceasing to give thanks for him, is at the essence of the deepest of our sin. So God's presence was covenanted. We won't go into that at this point. From the beginning with Abraham, the idol worshipper, the glory of God appeared and was maintained to Israel by God's covenant. Or we could say the God of glory appeared to Abraham. God's presence forming Israel. In the Exodus, the covenant reached a new formative phase as the Lord galvanized Israel into a nation. His formation of Israel as his own special treasure was achieved through salvation and the giving of the law. Both these actions of God revolve around Israel knowing and delighting in the Lord's presence. Both salvation and the receiving of the law are given personally by the Lord, and both in that sense are sacraments of his ongoing presence. So Israel's worship was a witness to the presence of the Lord. It was actually a witness to participation in and with the Lord. It wasn't just a witness that he was with them. It was a witness that they actually shared in his life. All Israel's worship and service flowed from the Lord's delight in being present and her delight in his presence. Remember the great cry, Song of Songs, "My beloved is mine." Israel's perpetual flirting and seduction by the idols of the nations surrounding her must be seen in this light. She is not a special treasure in name and status only. In treasuring Israel and remaining faithful, that should be, to her by treasuring her continually, God actually changed her heart. That's how it is with us. She would have to press against that change and deny the power of love, and thus rage against the person of God present if she was to be seduced by the idols. In other words, she had to suppress the truth of the presence of God. She had to turn to the idols and the sandiness of what they produced, and she had to take handfuls of that dry sand and suck it into her mouth and say, "This is the river of the delights of God." God's presence and Israel's destiny. After the worship of the golden calf, Moses cried, "If your presence will not go with me or with us, don't bring us up from here." John Durham, in his Exodus commentary, makes this point. Without Yahweh's presence, Israel and Moses are not just certain to fail the destiny set before them, they can't even begin it, because they will have lost their identity as a special treasure, Yahweh's own kingdom of priests and holy people. Israel's witness then, God's presence against the idols. This is the most important part of how God establishes them as a witness to the nations who are ravaged continually by the idols. Exodus is the account of God's nation emerging from within the idols of Egypt into a people who would worship the Lord as a true, adoring member of his family. Now that's a great chasm to get through or to get over. His firstborn, that is Israel, pregnant with the inheritance of the nation, remember, let my son go. Israel's emergence from Egypt as God's nation is not just a description of events, but the story of the personal intervention of God and his ongoing intimacy. Remember, you yourselves, he said, have seen what I did and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. This poetic narrative, probably used in doxological form in Israel's worship, provides a summary of all Moses' proof of presence passages. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians emphasises the Lord's dramatic personal intervention in the judgments upon Pharaoh and then his army at the sea. This intervention was not simply political, for Pharaoh was seen in Egypt as a god king. The Lord's personal triumph over him was therefore a witness to the nation Egypt that he was indeed the Lord of heaven and earth, and thus all the nations. And Egypt's probably never got over that, in one sense. Moses, in his song, later in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 1-43, called upon the whole earth to hear Israel's praise for the Lord's personal intervention. So calling Israel to be a priest nation was no calling to a strange or foreign way for humanity. It was a restoration, a call back to the essence, an irrepressible overflowing witness to the glory of God's loving. To bear them on eagle's wings then illustrates the Lord's omnipotent and tender presence in extracting them from the idols and the bondage of Egypt. We noted that the victory over Egypt and the exodus of Israel represented more than mere freedom from a stronger power. We turn these things into hero stories so quickly, don't we? Pharaoh, as Egypt's god king, was seen by the nation as the one who kept creation in order. Here was the fruit of the fall working itself out at national level. That is, man operating under the illusion of control. when Yahweh gave the 10 plagues and then delivered Israel's escape through the sea, the whole validity of Pharaoh's rule as God King was overturned. In Israel's Exodus, God announced to all flesh that idolatry and idol-serving nations must take notice of the God present with Israel. In fact, Moses declared that nothing like the salvation of Israel and her communion with God had been seen since Eden. These are his words from Deuteronomy. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on the earth, and ask from one end of the heaven to the other, whether such a great thing as this has ever happened or was ever heard of. Moses was blown away. Did any people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you've heard, and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of other nations, by trials, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown, that you might know that the Lord is God, and there is no other beside him. So Israel's testimony then was the favour of God, the favour of God's presence. Yahweh's presence was essential for Israel to know that his favour was upon them. It was his presence, as indicating his favour, that distinguished them from the nations. In Exodus 33:16, Moses says, "For how shall it be known that I have found favour in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, and I and your people from every other people on the face of the earth?" This has been the clear lesson given to Moses and Israel whenever God has graciously intervened for them. Again from Durham. Only Yahweh's presence with Moses and Israel separates them from all other peoples throughout the world. It is the lesson Moses learnt on Sinai at the time of his call. He alone was not equal to the task of challenging Pharaoh, but he was not to be alone. It is the lesson that Israel learned by the mighty acts in Egypt, by the deliverance at the sea, by the guidance and provision in the wilderness, and above all, by the theophany and the revelation at Sinai. What they had seen, what they had been given, what they had the chance of becoming, all were the direct result of the presence in the midst of Yahweh. The presence of Yahweh meant the blessing, the presence of his blessings and his cursings. The giftings of his holy life worked out in the daily practice of Israel's life. Her priesthood to the nation, in one sense, was a very mundane thing. This life was to make, in Brueggemann's terms, Israel dazzling in the eyes of the nation. He says, "A God so near and statutes so just, laws, commandments and procedures that assume a community of neighbourly economic and political practices showed the watching nations that the socially powerless in Israel, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, are treated according to social policies and practices that curb oppression and exploitation." In other words, this was very different to what was going on in all of the nations around them. All through the book of Deuteronomy, the tradition, he says, is at pains to hold together the holy presence and social practice, for either alone is inadequate and will not grasp the attention of the nations. Israel's priestly life, we're going to look at now as being structured by the presence of God. Not just a word from God, not just instructions for God, but by the power of his presence. If Israel was to be the unique priest nation showing the presence of Yahweh, How then did that work out in practice? How was Israel able to declare the glory of God? As God's special treasure, she was holy. That is, she was separated as a people from all other nations because she belonged to God and belonged with God. There's a difference there, isn't there? It's okay to belong to God. That can still be a very impersonal thing. But to belong with God is something else. To be with Him. In Israel, the nations could see in familial terms God and man at table are sat down. Israel's holiness was not an ethical end in itself. It was the outworking expression of her love and delight in God by the hearty and free acceptance of His law. This is what freedom from bondage, the bondage of Egypt, was all about. Israel was freed to be in God's image, not merely free from making bricks. Out of the chaos of a nation gripped with idols, a new nation with a heart for God was born. Moses says, "For this commandment that I command you today, it's not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you can do it." In other words, her life was a conversation with God. His conversation to her, evoking her conversation with His. She rarely lived, perhaps we could say, in the goodness of this. But that did not diminish for 1 second the power and the beauty of the presence of God with her. And she becomes, in Paul's terms, I guess, that cracked earthenware pot with whom or through whom God declares Himself to the nations as the God of all grace. Israel's acceptable worship was a total life orientation. That's what she gave to the nations. As she depended upon the grace of the Lord's presence and related internally and towards her neighbours out of the goodness of that, God would declare His name to the nations. Israel's obedience was far removed from the service of other nations to their idols. Idolatry, in one sense, is the world's brilliant scheme to attempt to insulate themselves from direct contact with the Lord whom they rejected. In Israel, God was not only present but active. Suddenly a nation was travelling as human beings should, in complete delight in God. This was the way Israel would honour Him. Obedience, so called, apart from ontological delight, is simply a return to subservience and bondage to harsh images. I think it's Brigham in his little book, Finally Comes the Poet, speaking about obedience today, says obedience is either seen as a virtue too much celebrated, in other words, the focus becomes something that we do, or a burden too much dreaded. Now, God had liberated Israel into a delight in Him because He was present. That's the point that we're making here. God made this point clearly to Israel. The importance, the link between their joyfulness and their gladness of heart in obedience and their relationship with Him. He says, because you did not serve the Lord your God with joyfulness and gladness of heart. Why? Because of the abundance of all things. That's another way of saying, well, He was present and all of His blessings and His inheritance was there. Because you would not serve, He says, you wouldn't serve me because of my abundance of all things to you with joyfulness and gladness of heart. Therefore you will serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and lacking everything. Paul provides us with a snapshot of the glory of being God's special possession and a holy nation. And we're going to explore those briefly in the last moments of the study. And what we're going to see, I hope, we're familiar with all of these things, the glory and the covenants and the law and the worship and the promises. But what I want to do is try and indicate to us how that each one of these is actually the presence of God in the life of the people, forming the life of the people, that they declare that glory willingly and with joy to the nations. So Paul said, they are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship and the promises. To them belong the fathers. From their race, according to the flesh, is the Christ, who is God over all, blessed forever. It was through these blessings that Israel's daily life was structured. Each of these blessings contained the promise of what God had planned for all flesh. So they become a startling revelation of what would eventually come to the nations through Christ, the true Israel. The name Israel, given to Jacob at the point of his immediacy, that is his wrestling with God, Israel becomes the name for God's priest nation. This mysterious exchange marks the start of the intimate wrestling of God with his people. They lived where the fire burned. Is it Forsyth that said, as pastors, we live where the fire burns? Israel lived where the fire burns. This wrestling with God, with his people, and their receiving of his blessing. Calvin commented, God transferred the praise of his own strength to Jacob for the purpose of triumphing in his person. Think about that one. The formation of Israel was always accompanied by a touching of her hip, that the nations may see the God of grace, not a nation bent on the theology of glory. Might want to explore what that means perhaps later in the questions. At the end of his life, Jacob, that is Israel, prayed that his nation might live on in Joseph's sons and extend all that the name implied to the ends of the earth. The adoption of sons. Israel is redeemed back to sonship. So you'll say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he might serve me. Israel's life was to be familial, and its worship would declare that Yahweh, their divine Father, was at the centre of her present life and future hope. The passion of God for her firstborn, for his firstborn, was seen by the effect of his presence as their Creator and Father and Redeemer. The first response of sonship is enjoyment, living in the joy of God, living in delight. Obedience is in there, isn't it? But there's no sense that God brings Israel out of Exodus to be glum. She is a singing people, and that song is the song of God over her, and that song must go to the nations. Israel's energy for daily living would have come from inheriting all the Father's riches, for they knew that was the blessing of firstborns. Unlike the fickle and harsh experience meted out by the idols of other nations, Yahweh's passion for his Son was seen sometimes in its most blazing grace when his Son turned from the delight of the inheritance. What idol ever does that? These are some of the most beautiful words in the Old Testament, I think, spoken by God to Israel. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they didn't know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws. Yahweh's present treasuring, disciplining and nurturing of Israel was like nothing seen across the face of the nations. Every word and deed that Israel did in the freedom and delight of sonship cried out to the nations the future glory of their inheritance as well. In Israel's joyful living as the family of God, there was the reverse echo of the true Son, who would not only come out of the exodus of man's Egypt, but would flood the nations with the Holy Spirit, the blessing of Abraham. Israel's internal priesthood was with a view to communicating to the nations the grace of living as a beloved Son. The glory. The glory of God's presence was seen physically in Israel, that was seen physically in Israel, was the glory at Mount Sinai, the glory that covered and filled the tabernacle, the glory that appeared on the mercy seat in the Holy of Holies, and the glory that filled the temple. This glory was the sign of God's presence with Israel, and certified to Israel that God dwelt amongst them and met with them. The meeting was with a view to speaking with them and sanctifying them by the presence of His glory. So the fact that God was present, displaying His glory, formed and kept Israel as a people who were to be constantly looking to Him. The glory of the idols could be seductive and brilliant, but no idol could manifest true glory. The praise of God's glory was to be proclaimed by Israel across the whole earth. The continual impact of God's glory was to convince Israel of God's riches, power and position. To proclaim God's glory to the nation, Israel must first know it in her heart. The essence of this slowness to anger, steadfast love and covenant faithfulness. We should not underestimate the impact of Israel living out this knowledge among the nations. The covenants. Nothing separated Israel from the idolatrous nations like God's covenant. Idol worship demanded that the worshippers make all kinds of manipulative deals with the idols in order to obtain their blessing. In God's covenant, the order was reversed. God made covenant with Israel, established the freedom of communion by grace, and called Israel sovereignly to enjoy it and treasure it. The elements of covenant life from the beginning were a practical witness to the nations of the way God's creatures truly live. Israel's vocation to replenish the earth, rule over it, her life within God's Sabbath rest, and participation in the grace of marriage had within them all the blessings needed to declare the full glory of God to the nations. Other nations looking in on these blessings would have been faced with a revelation of how things really are. As we've noted earlier, the law, the 10 words, were given as a sacrament of God's life and presence to Israel and all flesh. For Israel, the law meant the ability to live as the image of God, the presence of God in glory by covenant love. To adopt Israel fleshes out the I am part of the Decalogue and transmits the creative energy to the thou shalt. The law then was given in the first place for Israel's good, but many of Israel's scriptures point to the universal gift of the law as the way all flesh must live in the image of God. Their worship, the festivals, fasts and order of their corporate worship all made Israel the people of worship. With the presence of God and His prescription for worship, a new national gift emerged to the world. Here was a people blessed to return to the Edenic joy where the independence of sin was reversed. Now God had supplied the revelation leading to a true honouring and giving thanks for Him. This was Israel's vocation. Her worship was not a mishmash of ideas collected from the nations, for that would have simply brought her back into idolatry. By His presence, the old gave way and the real worship was enjoyed. The promises. Israel's priesthood was not to be the final story. God, in speaking to Israel and leading Israel, was leading her to his Son. In him all the covenants and the law and the worship would come to its full universal pitch. Israel was like a high-tension power line supported by the pylons of God's promises. The promises of God to Israel were reminders of their inheritance as his firstborn son. No other nation was made the recipient of such promises, yet all other nations were to come to Israel to become the recipients of the same promised blessings. So the fathers also bear that intimate testimony of God with them and their delight in that. So we come to this final section, Israel's priesthood of the presence. So Israel's inheritance as the treasured possession, the holy nation that thrust her onto the international scene as the witness to God, was rich. Nothing like what was seen in Israel had appeared before. In the place of idolatry flashed the true worship and service of the Lord of heaven and earth. In the place of supposed independence from God that had spawned deadening rebellion and hatred of God, flowed a new ontological delight and honouring of him, out of which flowed a hearty obedience. How is the best way to honour someone? To enjoy them. Then you don't stop talking about them. Israel was to become the place to which all the nations would come to know the Lord. That very powerful passage from Isaiah, that the nations would beat a path to Zion. And then this final quote from Spurgeon's Treasury of David, quoting Molurus. The people of God, speaking of Israel, were not shut up in that narrow corner of the earth for the purpose of confining within their straitened territories the true knowledge and worship of God. But God wished that to be the fixed seat of the church, from which the sound of the heavenly doctrine should go forth into all nations. Therefore he chose Canaan, which is interjected amongst the most powerful nations of the world, that from it, as from a fountain, might more easily issue the doctrine of God to the rest of the nations. As Isaiah says, out of Zion will go forth the law. So we're morning tea.